Hello and welcome to TFF Teacher from Finland. My name is Jouni Vilkka, and in this video I will talk about the methods of philosophy, as I promised to do in the previous video in this series. So, philosophy is not an empirical science, as you probably already knew. Philosophers do not, at least usually, conduct experiments like scientists do. They do not even conduct observations in the way that is done in social sciences or cultural studies, for example. The tools of philosophy have to do with thinking, and philosophers have always been striving at being good thinkers. So what is good thinking? While philosophical thinking can be thought of and practiced as a dialogue or a discussion among several people even, it can more often be practiced individually. There are certain aspects to good philosophical thinking. The following explanation of what good thinking is, or what it is like, is based on a school book called Idea 1. Philosophy is often said to begin in wonderment. Children are said to be natural at this, because nothing is obvious to a young child. A philosopher should strive to be like a young child in this sense. Wondering about something they have encountered or reflecting on their own thinking or behavior, a philosopher can question the obvious, the assumptions taken for granted. They can formulate a clear question about what they pay attention to, disregarding our everyday assumptions. A philosopher needs good imagination and empathy, the ability to think of various alternative viewpoints and possible solutions, or answers to their questions. They must be creative and without prejudice. They have to try and understand different perspectives. While being open-minded, there must still remain the critical assessment of alternatives, an application of criteria. They need to recognize their own presumptions and those of others in order to constructively analyze the various claims and alternative solutions. Finally, they need to formulate their own justified view, opinion, or solution to the problem with utmost honesty. If they cannot properly justify their claim, then they must accept the resulting uncertainty. So far, this has been pretty general, but now I'm going to explain what exact methods philosophers use. And in these following few sections, I am relying mostly on a digital school book published by Studio for this introductory course to philosophy for high schools. Method is a systematic way of pursuing a goal, such as the truth of a matter. And various sciences utilize many different methods, as different tools are typically needed for different jobs. The methods of philosophy are all mental exercises. They may not be unique to philosophy, but they are typical of philosophy in that philosophers do little else beyond mental exercises, as philosophers anyway. These methods include at least the following: debate and dialogue, thought experiment, conceptual analysis, presentation of counterexamples, exposing the implicit assumptions in thinking, introspection, logic, and assessment of argumentation. I will explain the last two of these methods in a later video. And since I already explained what discussion, debate, and dialogue have to do with philosophy in the previous video, I will now not repeat myself. Instead, I will just jump right into thought experiments. And here are some examples of thought experiments you may already have heard of. Plato's cave, the Cartesian demon, or brain in a vat, or the movie Matrix, The Matrix. What does it feel like to be a bat? The Chinese room, or Turing's test. The black and white room, and others. So, the main point of thought experiments is to inspire more open-minded questioning, to see things differently, or how things could be in some kind of an alternative reality, perhaps. Or, what if something that is or seems unusual or strange to us, but what if that were the case anyway? So thought experiments are not meant to lead to definitive answers or to solve difficult issues or questions, but they may broaden our mental horizons so that we can think of new possible solutions. I will, in some later videos, go into more depth regarding various thought experiments. But now, let's look at probably the most important method used by philosophers, conceptual analysis. It may be obvious that without agreement on the meaning of words, especially terms central to the discussion, we will all just be talking past each other. We may have different understandings, interpretations of the various terms we are using, for example. It's not that my interpretation is right and yours is wrong, at least not obviously. But as long as there is such a fundamental disagreement, it will be difficult to even communicate further. When we clarify and define the concepts we use, the likelihood of coming to an agreement becomes much greater, and at the very least, but also importantly, we will be more likely to understand exactly what each of us is saying. When we agree to a definition of a term, we are talking about a so-called nominal definition. So it's based on an agreement on the meaning of the word, basically. Ancient philosophers thought they could go beyond that and find a real definition, which would capture the essential features or qualities of whatever was being defined. But few philosophers will try that anymore. Often it is useful to think of necessary and sufficient conditions for a definition. Necessary condition is such that a thing has to fulfill it in order for the definition to apply. For example, something can only be a dog if it is an animal. that is a necessary condition, but it is not sufficient because there are other animals, such as cats, for example, which are not dogs. A lie has to be a dishonest claim, so that's a necessary condition. But the claim does not have to be false, because the liar may also claim something to be false while they know that it is in fact true. But dishonesty is not a sufficient condition for something to be a lie if there are other forms of dishonesty. For example, if stealing is considered a form of dishonesty. Stealing is not the same as lying. I guess we might have to define what we mean by dishonesty before we can decide whether it is both a necessary and sufficient condition for something to be a lie. It is possible in some cases that something is both a necessary and sufficient condition at the same time. Once defined, the concepts can be categorized and further analyzed. Often disagreements can even evaporate when the relevant concepts have been analyzed, and it becomes obvious that the disagreeing people were actually speaking of different things. So there was no real disagreement about the substance. Concepts can also be used deceptively in advertising, say. The word natural is often used that way. Looking into the concept can free you from the influence of those advertisers. It is possible that once the concept has been analyzed, a contradiction in the use and meaning of the concept becomes apparent. For example, if someone talks about a married bachelorette, it doesn't take much of a philosopher to realize that there's something strange going on. Sometimes concepts come in pairs, such as general and special, where the latter is meant to be just a more narrowly defined example of the more general thing. The most famous use of these must be in the theories of Albert Einstein about relativity, obviously. Another often used concept pair is that of subjective versus objective. It is generally thought that an individual's experiences are subjective, accessible only to that individual, and not necessarily having much to do with the reality outside that person's mind. Objective, on the other hand, is thought to refer to the reality outside and independent of the mind of any person. So while the sciences strive for objectivity, what they can more accurately be said to achieve is actually intersubjectivity, an agreement between observing subjects, rather than true objectivity, which is pretty much impossible to achieve. But we'll return to this when discussing philosophy of science. Different viewpoints can be analyzed also in terms of emic and ethic, as used in cultural studies, such as anthropology and comparative religion, for example. Emic refers to the insider's understanding of the concept or the idea or action. And ethic refers to the outside observer's understanding of the same thing. The scientific observer who does not share the worldview of the people they are observing will naturally have a different understanding of what, for example, is the function of a ritual. Whereas members of the group being studied will think of the ritual in terms of their own belief system. So both the observer and the observed may use the word ritual, but mean very different things. Words can also be used in speech acts, which are different from statements or claims, in that instead of describing reality, they are ways of performing functions, doing things with words, even changing social reality in some way. These speech acts need to be recognized for what they are and analyzed accordingly, of course. For example, when an official at the magistrate's office states that you are now husband and wife, or each other's spouses, or whatever it is they say, they are not describing reality, but rather prescribing how these people are to be treated from now on, for example, in the eyes of the law. The next method is the use of counterexamples. One way to poke holes in a theory that claims to explain something completely in a very general manner or universally is to provide a counterexample for it. For example, if I were to claim that all swans are white, you need only to show me an example of a pink or any non-white swan, and you have proven me wrong. This makes counterexample a very powerful method of testing or even demolishing theories. The example used in the counterexample, that is, does not have to be an actual existing thing, because philosophical theories, ideas, are conceptual mental constructs. A thought experiment, for example, may be enough to show the idea to be implausible, or at least in serious need of improvement. The Chinese room, for example, is a thought experiment that was designed to disprove a philosophical theory. It did not necessarily succeed, but it's an example of that kind of use of a thought experiment. Another example would be the so-called Cartesian theater used by Daniel C. Dennett. I will return to both of these examples later on at some point. The next method is exposing the implicit assumptions in thinking. Especially in our everyday lives, in our normal speech, we often make claims and demands, and we may not be aware of all the so-called background assumptions that those claims or demands are based on. An implicit assumption is an assumption that is not explicitly stated. It is implicit. So it is also at the same time as a background assumption, it is necessary for the argument to actually work. So we make these arguments or claims or demands or whatever, but we are not necessarily aware of all the assumptions that are required for these, whatever they are, to work. Let's use the statement, if Socrates drinks the poison, he will die, as an example. It seems pretty obvious. Somewhat even think it's necessarily true, but even this obvious looking statement requires several background assumptions to be true. For example, Socrates has to be a mortal, fairly ordinary human. At least he's capable of dying. And 2, he does not have an antidote for the poison that would save him. And 3, he has not developed resistance to the poison, as might be possible in the case of some poisons. So, if any one of these assumptions turns out to be false, the whole statement is false. In some cases, the background assumptions are obvious, but in other cases, you may need to practice your imagination pretty much to be able to think of what assumptions are required for the claim. And even if you do manage to come up with some background assumptions, they are not necessarily wrong assumptions to make. It is still good to be aware of them. The final method in this video that I will explain is introspection. It is a method that school books don't seem to mention usually, but philosophers may, and in my opinion should, use. Introspection means turning your mental focus inside into your own thoughts and emotions, trying to understand them, but not understand them just as propositions or sentences, but also looking for the reasons why you are thinking those things or experiencing those emotions. Why right now? Where do those emotions come from? For example, in your personal history. And why do you or don't you feel strongly about that whatever thing is going on? Usually, I would say you feel strongly about something, and then you should probably know why you feel strongly about it. This method or technique helps you grow your self-awareness, your self-knowledge. Know thyself. It can also help you become aware of your possibly questionable motives, or to see what your values really are. You may then either embrace them or work to change them. Introspection is a method that has been used by psychologists. It's worth pointing out that psychology used to be part of philosophy for a very long time, only becoming an independent science in the middle of the 19th century. Introspection may not be used much in academic philosophy, but it may be useful in helping you to form your own philosophy of life. There is something similar to introspection called phenomenology, another method used by philosophers, and it also has to do with experience, but in a different way. I'll possibly make a dedicated video about that one day. The next video will be about formulating an argument properly. See you then.